Welcome, everyone. I'm Hester Serebrin. I'm the Policy Director at Transportation Choices Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us at Innovations in Access, our transit talk today. I want to thank our panelists, Councilmember Rob Johnson for sponsoring us to be in this room, Seattle Channel for our filming, and Rachel Lobo in the back, our education manager who pulled this event together. If you don't already know us, Transportation Choices, or TCC, is a statewide nonprofit that focuses on bringing Washingtonians more and better transportation options. We tend to focus our work on building out a strong transit network, something reliable, fast, sustainable, frequent, as the backbone of our region's transportation system. But we also know that a transit system is only as strong as the networks, local transit, biking, walking, that connect people to it. So in other words, getting to transit is half the battle. But we don't want it to be a battle, which is why we focus a lot of work in the city and the county trying to build out safe, easy, comfortable networks to get people to transit. So in the kind of urbanist paradise, I think we all picture these dense, walkable, mixed-use, transit-oriented development neighborhoods around transit where people can just hop on a bike and walk to transit. But people also talk about the city and Puget Sound as this kind of awkward, gangly teenager where we're experiencing a lot of growth, but our transit system and our local networks haven't quite caught up to that. And so the reality is that a lot of people depend on motorized options to get to transit. And so given that, how can we make the best of those first and last mile connections? How do we regulate parking, shared mobility, and others to get at the outcomes we want to see, which is affordable access, safe access, fewer new parking structures maybe, reduced stormwater runoff, less reliance on single occupancy vehicles. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We've got a great panel with some private sector innovative agencies to see what they're up to, what the successes have been, and what the challenges are. So leading this conversation is our fearless moderator, Josh Cohen, a writer for the esteemed NextCity. And our panel consists of Daniel Rowe, a senior transportation planner at King County Metro, where he leads the Connecting to Transit team. Naomi Doerner is the SDOT's Transportation Equity Program Manager. We've got Evan Corey, also from SDOT, the new Mobility Program Manager, and Peter Dempster, who leads strategy and market development for ReachNow, a mobility service company. And so I'm going to hand off to Josh now. Thank you, guys.
Let's start by defining what we're talking about here. There's been a lot of speculation about how emerging transportation technology is going to shape our near and long-term transportation future. Briefly, what do each of you think is likely to happen in the next couple of decades with transportation technology, and how will it affect your work, agency, company?
Thanks, Josh, for the great question. I work for ReachNow. ReachNow is the mobility services arm of the BMW group. BMW, of course, is a large German auto manufacturer. One of the trends that we're responding to with some of the products that we've brought to market are really around access over ownership. It's a huge trend that we see, especially in dense urban environments, Seattle being one of them. And we're responding to that trend by building really a seamless experience around mobility. And that includes car sharing and ride sharing and other automobility solutions that really give people the freedom to not own a car and instead just use it for as long or as little as they want. On the car side, that means that we need to make cars more shareable. And so there's a lot of development that we're doing with our colleagues in Munich to make every car that comes off the line really shareable. And with that means that we need to do things like personalization so that when you get into that shared car, the seat position isn't the same as the person who was in it previously. It's exactly what you want, and the temperature is right, and the radio station is KEXP and not NPR because that's what you like. So those are things that that we're working intensely on the technology side that are informed by big trends that we see in the industry.
Yeah, so I think it's really hard to say what's going to happen in the next decade. There's so much happening now, and it changes so quickly. It's more the role of the city and the role of government agencies is to be prepared for the changes and help to shape how the changes occur on our streets. So one of the things that the City of Seattle and SDOT have done is created a strategic document that we've called the New Mobility Playbook. And it essentially acknowledges that there's changes happening, and it acknowledges a lot of the potential benefits, but also the potential risks that could occur from all of this change, and sets a framework to respond to the changes. And so that's a really unique approach that really hasn't been taken by many of the cities across the country. It's driven by the values, our core values that we have in our city. And there's a really strong emphasis on equity and climate, data sharing, and providing a space for innovators to play in Seattle, but also to ensure that we have the public benefits that are being received by the people that live in this city. One notable item about the playbook is that this is a six-month document. So the intent is to review the contents of the document every 6 months and update it, because that's the role, or that's the length of the technology cycle. So companies roll out new ideas and new products every 6 months or so. And so we can't be developing 5-year or 20-year visions for shared mobility or new mobility when things are happening every 6 months. So that's really unique, and we're really excited to see how everything moves forward over the next years.
Basically, we have a system right now where we are seeing disruptions already, and so we know that technology is going to continue to disrupt, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. I'm not assigning like positive or negative. It's happening. There are changes, and they're really drastic. And I think that I'll start with the good news. On the good, optimistic side, I would love to see sort of the marriage of tech and transportation down the path, whether it's a year to 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that it would offer greater efficiency, lower operation costs. I mean, that's huge, and also true partnership. I think that the concern that we have and that are potentially outlined in the New Mobility Playbook is maybe that there are some darker, or there's like a more cynical take, and that is that with all of the VC interests, like venture capital interests, that are kind of a part of this disruption, that if and when those were to go away, and eventually that kind of bubble would burst, we've seen it happen in other technology spaces, that we would be left with a void, and potentially that the public transportation could be cannibalized, and we would be left with sort of this piecemeal system that actually makes it harder to connect across systems. And so I think that there's these two very different scenarios. We don't know exactly which way it's going to go, but we can inform. And so that is really the role that we're taking on. And I think that in order for the latter not to happen, the more cynical take to not happen, that we as government really need to work in partnership and in strategy with both the business community, the technology community, but also, and really critically, the community and the public, right? The users of these technologies and of these public spaces, because they are public spaces that they're operating in. And so I think that we really need to think of ourselves, right, as disruptors, and that we really need to ensure that the race and social equity aspects of disruption are front and center as we move forward in the space.
The general trend we're seeing is services like ReachNow and others are going to grow, and they're going to become cheaper, and hopefully more efficient, and realize some of those positive benefits. But I think they're going to capture more and more market share. And from our perspective, we want to make sure, I think that presents both a challenge and an opportunity for public transit. I think the challenge is that, again, this attractive, door-to-door, custom, your temperature, your radio station, that's a pretty attractive option, and especially if it's affordable. But we want to make sure that in most corridors and most trips, that public transit is going to be the most attractive option. We need to make sure that's happening from a regional perspective to meet our land use goals, our mobility goals, our climate goals. So First of all, we need to really make sure we're giving public transit the right of way on the street. We're making sure it's getting the proper investment, and we really pay close attention to that. And also, I think the opportunity lies in really having these services, complete the network. So there's going to be places, there's going to be times when we're not able to serve a market with a 40-foot bus. So how can we partner with these services to fill a gap and really provide that first last mile service? And that's with that framework, Metro's developed an action agenda that really speaks to this space and talks about how we're going to leverage these shared mobility options, how we're going to make sure that we're using the best data and we're getting the best data we can, making sure we're fostering a culture of innovation at Metro and with our partners. And really, again, look for the opportunities, but also make sure we're recognizing our core business and what we believe is the future, which is to make sure that most of these corridors are giving priority to mass transit, the most efficient form, and these services are really helping fill the gaps.
Great. I think you guys hit a lot already on the good and the bad, best case scenario, worst case scenario, best case being these new technologies complement the existing transit system and become feeders into the transit system, worst case being everyone only uses private mobility and cannibalizes the ridership of transit and takes away the budget, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I would ask, is there anything else you want to hit on the potential good of new mobility intersecting with transit? And for the agency folks, what can the city or county do to sort of get us to the best case scenario, whether it's policy, whether it's taxes, whether it's incentives?
Okay, do you want me to start?
If there's other good.
Great. So I think Daniel got it exactly right. We, in addition to wanting to provide a suite of services, automobility services that meet a lot of your needs, I think what we're seeing emerge is that we also close the transit gap in a lot of places in all the cities that we operate. We know this because nearly all of our members have an ORCA card, for example, in Seattle. When we ask our members how they use our service, 23% of them told us in the last survey that we ran that they use ReachNow to get to or from public transit to their home. So we know that that there is a huge opportunity in being a feeder to high-capacity public transit. We're very supportive of efforts to expand it, obviously, because that opportunity is huge. One example of where we are partnering with transit agencies in all the cities in which we operate is we're looking at ways to offer convenient drop-off at park and ride locations to enable our members to very conveniently and seamlessly get to and from public transportation. And from our perspective, it's great for business. It means that we're going to get more trips, which is exciting, obviously, because we're growing. But from the transit agency's perspective, we're seen as a transportation demand management strategy. So that's also exciting.
So there's been a lot of research that's been done over the last couple of years to start to understand the impact of shared mobility relative to transit. And one of the most recent pieces of work that's been done is out of the Shared Use Mobility Center. They found that there's a core group of people that use shared mobility services that they're calling super sharers, which is a wonky name, but what they found is essentially the more that you use shared mobility services, the higher your use of transit becomes, and that even becomes higher when you get rid of your car. And so there is, they can be complementary, certainly. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure if you want to connect to transit using a shared mode, that there's space made available for that connection to be made. And so one thing that I always talk about is the fact that shared mobility modes, private mobility modes, they do not inherently integrate with transit. There's some level of coordination that needs to happen at the agency level. There's some level of infrastructure coordination that needs to happen. And so we've been doing a lot of work with Sound Transit and King County Metro to ensure that that happens. Another big benefit that could occur from the increase of shared mobility services is a better understanding of our transportation system. So a lot of these services have great information about how to get around, but if they're in silos, then the confusion around making connections is exacerbated. And so one thing that we're really interested in doing is finding new ways to aggregate transportation information into really easy to use platforms, either on your phone or on a digital screen at transit stations. It's a really easy way to ensure that people understand how to get around without a car.
So I think a lot about transportation costs. As the Transportation Equity Program Manager, I really have been in my role for about 5 months, and with the inaffordability of the city and that growing, the crisis that we're in, part of what we are trying to do at SDOT is reduce overall transportation costs. And one of the main ways we know that we can do that is by, providing ways for people to live car light and car free. And so Evan already mentioned, so in addition to the gaps and just providing access where there are gaps in communities that have experienced or are experiencing transportation challenges, first and last mile connections. We also understand that, with transportation and specifically car ownership being the second highest household cost, particularly and increasingly so for communities that are cost burdened, we are really hoping that we can create strategies that will provide incentives for people to try these services out. We understand that the need to better market is going to be a pretty outsized cost because currently, there is a lot of marketing, but how we better market in and with communities and develop the strategies in and with communities is really going to make the difference as to whether they can want to participate. But then there's also some barriers. I can talk about that because I'm supposed to be talking about the good things. But I think that the the underlying goal is that to the extent that we can help people live car-free and car-light, and also reduce transportation costs and congestion overall to the system, the better off we feel that we'll all be. So those are the main ways. And then I also want to just touch on, some of the ideas around how this could potentially be incentivized. So I think we also need to think about not just the technology innovation, but also the policy innovation. And sometimes it's the policies that are right in front of us. So we have the commuter trip reduction program. So you have employers with a threshold and they have to meet this threshold, but they provide, many of you probably have it, but employers will provide basically transit options, and it's part of their travel demand management. So there are a number of companies or employers who do not meet the threshold. And so what would it look like for us to partner in and with technology service providers and do some sort of programming that would allow for these groups to as part of a cooperative, right? That is not new. It's like the old new, and use some sort of policy mechanism to consider these smaller groups, but as a whole, a collective, a large group, and be able to provide incentives that would not just be for transit, but also these emergent transportation options as well.
I just want to piggyback off your comment about incentives and subsidies. So the government has a really important role to either require some sort of subsidized program within private transportation services, or actually provide subsidies themselves. So we subsidize certain types of transportation trips, and that's going to be an important role in the future. I would like to mention that there are actually some private transportation services that are actually reducing the cost by themselves. We haven't even regulated them on this. These are the private bike share companies. They've actually, two of the companies have developed their own, their low-income programs. And I think that kind of work is going to continue to happen beyond bike share. And move into other shared mobility services because they're, I guess, from a market-driven perspective, they want to drive more people to their services. And so I think that that's something that we'll start to see in the near future.
So I want to pick up on a theme, or on this theme of incentives, and talk a little bit about how Metro is reevaluating how we're getting people to our service, and also pick up on a theme that Hester opened up with, which is our park and rides. So we have, in a lot of our suburban areas, we have these very popular park and rides. They're critical nodes to the transit system. There's a fixed amount of parking there, and they're very popular. So we're finding that they're filling up earlier in the morning, and there's this kind of mad dash to find a spot, and then they get maxed out, and then people are left to find another option, whether that be find a less desirable park and ride, or park in the neighborhood, or drive all the way downtown and pay a pretty high price to park. So currently our park and rides are free. So we pay a lot of money, or we have paid a lot of money to build this infrastructure, and we offer it free, first come, first serve to our customers. So on the one hand, our recently adopted long-range plan, Metro Connects, has called for us to think about how we can better manage these facilities, and to think about how we introduce pricing into that management system. So we're not there today, but we're thinking about it, working with our partners. And on the other hand, thinking about how can we get, if these facilities are maxing out at 7:30 in the morning, how can we get more people to these transit hubs? And that's one thing we're working on right now, is we're actually in the middle of a procurement to figure out, is there one of these new mobility providers that we can partner with and get folks an alternative way to get to the transit service. That's what they want to get to. They don't want a parking spot. They want to get on the bus or train and get to their destination. So how can we help make sure customers realize that there are these first last mile connections out there? That's one thing. And then how can we make sure that they're affordable? So that's, I think, where the subsidy comes in, and rethinking where we're putting our investments to get people to our services. Perhaps it's either about the same amount or even cheaper for us to get someone, help buy down their trip on a TNC, and get them to the park and ride and get them to where they're going. So this is really kind of one of the tangible places where we're trying to exercise some of this, shared mobility options on the service side, and then also on the facility side. So we need to really reevaluate how we design these facilities to incorporate more of these connections. As Peter mentioned, having safe and convenient places for drop-offs to happen, short-term parking. So this is something we've been working on, and we'll continue to work on, and think about what is the next transit hub look like? How do we retrofit a park and ride to really incorporate more of these services and have more of a multimodal hub?
Great. So if you have a question for the panelists, I've seen some of you writing. I think Rachel is going to start collecting them. In the meantime, so we've been talking a lot about new mobility, and that includes the existing car shares, ride-hailing services, bike share. A lot of the conversation around transportation technology has been about self-driving cars, robot cars. I am very curious to hear, maybe first from Peter. So the sort of utopian vision for self-driving cars is like mostly shared, all shared. It vastly reduced the amount of cars we need on the road. People don't need to own their own vehicle, theoretically. My question is, what is the incentive for major manufacturers to go with that shared model? Is GM or Ford really going to be that psyched on, hundreds of thousands of fewer vehicles being sold?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and just look at who we are. BMW, if you roughly translate the name, it's Bavarian Engine Factory or something like that. And here we are, talking about how we're sharing electric cars in cities for 40 to 50 cents per minute, and that's our new business model. So we don't necessarily see it as a killer of our industry. This is really an opportunity, and what we're doing at ReachNow is really aligning with a broader corporate strategy, and I think you see it emerging at other automakers around this transformational change and really driving it almost. So we're driving a transformational change from our original key performance indicator, which was how many cars did we sell this year, to something very different, looking more like how many minutes of driving or how many minutes of automobility did we provide to members. And so being a mobility provider is sort of the new model for our entire industry. So we don't see it as a killer. We just see it as the next future opportunity. And to get there, we're building a lot of new capabilities. Of course, I mentioned the transportation technologies that we're building, but things like connected and electric and shared, something we're doing today. And we're building capabilities that allow us to add automation to that.
So I think Peter's right. I think a lot of these auto manufacturers they've already, the writing's on the wall. They're already investing in this space. A specific example I can share: I was at a conference last week and talked to some folks who worked for Ford, and they are developing technology to have fair payment integrated to a sense that you don't even have to take your phone out of your pocket. Like, they use the GPS to figure out what mode you're on, and they would assign that fair payment to the right agency. And this is Ford, okay? Ford's already, they're investing in bike share, and I think that's just an example of the lengths these companies are going. So I think it's already there, and I think it's exciting that they're realizing that there's much more to this space.
I'm not going to comment much more on this, but it is kind of interesting that just about every single automaker around the world has some sort of new mobility group or some innovative shared mobility kind of working group. And then there's companies that are partnering with technology companies to create new products. So certainly there's a lot of thought going into the future of transportation, and a lot of investment too, billions and billions of dollars of investment. So they're looking at the trends and responding.
These are fantastic questions, and all of them, I wish I could ask all of them. I'm going to start with, since I was going to ask this question anyway, Naomi, you've already hit a little bit on the potential equity challenges. Do you have any further thoughts on, as the private sector takes a larger and larger role in in our transportation network, what are some of the concerns you have about whether or not we're creating 2-3-tiered transportation systems? How do we avoid that sort of future where private mobility is for the wealthy and the rest of us ride a decreasingly funded bus?
So I would say that, potential, but there are actual barriers and concerns and realities that we have to contend with. So the new paradigm of transportation with emergent transportation does not erase the existing barriers now, right, that are in our current, like the inequities that exist in our current transportation system, like those still exist, and those potentially, but also if we as city agencies, partners, government are not mindful in terms of how the rollout of these programs continues, it very, very likely will exacerbate those inequities that exist now. So, that's sort of my very ho-hum, I'm sorry that I don't have better news, perspective. However, I think that I'm really encouraged, I think, by the innovations that we're seeing that, like Evan already noted, there are companies and agencies and groups that are already really, just taking leadership and making decisions, and they're taking more human-centered approaches. I know that's a really wonky term, but centering the people and the users of the system in the design and sort of the program and the marketing and outreach strategies, to say nothing of like the actual job market opportunities that are going to be created and also impacted. So I think, how do I wrap this up? Basically, I think that we, cannot, there's this tension to do everything right, to do everything yesterday, especially on, I think, the city and sort of agency side. Like, we feel like we need to kind of keep this pace, and that it's got to be aligned with like what and how the tech space, how they want to move. But I think it's really important that we not move too quickly, because by doing that, by speeding the processes up to the point that like there isn't community input, there isn't opportunity to really think through what the concerns that we have not even yet surfaced may be, I think that would be doing a disservice to what we're actually trying to accomplish. So those are I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah. I mean, Naomi and I have had a lot of conversations about how we design how the system of tomorrow is designed, and a lot of that is actually being driven by people in Silicon Valley and people with a lot of money and people that are generally white. And so I think we need to have a really frank conversation in Seattle about what transportation looks like 5 or 10 years from now, and involve those people that could potentially be most impacted from the beginning, instead of saying, hey, this is happening now, what do you think about it? It needs to be kind of a flipping of the script.
One of the things we need to keep in mind is leveraging this pace we have going with investment in fixed route service. This region is making really big investments, and we need to keep in mind, even as new technologies, new vehicle types, new energy sources are coming out, we need to remember the simple geometry of how our region is put together and where we've invested in land use, and make sure that we're keeping our priorities straight, and making sure we're getting the investment in transit and also the right of way from cities, and really making that the most attractive option. But then thinking about how we can leverage these services, I think it's our role as government to make sure that they're accessible to everyone. So what can we do to help make sure that folks with disabilities or folks without smartphones or without debit or credit cards can have access to the service and connect to transit in the best way possible? So I think that's something we all need to remember here as we're trying to work with this new paradigm.
Great. I'm going to try to combine a few of these questions into one bigger question. There's a lot of questions about, obviously, a lot of new mobility's role is sort of solving that first mile, last mile problem. A few people asked about how to encourage biking and walking, or sort of what is SDOT's vision of the integration of new technology without, like, forgetting about biking and walking as a transportation choice. And also, what are your thoughts about sort of creating more space for biking, walking, and existing transit as we move forward?
Yeah, so we have been talking a lot about services and new mobility, but we haven't done a good job with transit access for people that are walking and biking in general, and that's continues today. And so we need to continue to build out our bike network, our all ages and abilities bike network, make sure that we're filling in the sidewalk network and ensuring that our intersections are safe to cross. And so that's always going to be a priority for us. I think your question was kind of like how how's technology going to
I guess
factor into that?
What is SDOT? What is SDOT doing to sort of keep biking and walking in mind? How are you going to improve conditions for biking and walking, or even transit, sort of moving forward as these technologies?
I mean, we have a really aggressive agenda to advance infrastructure implementation. So our transit master plan, we've been implementing that at a pretty furious pace. We have been doing a lot with the Move Seattle levy to ensure that the projects that we're obligated to build, we are actually building. And so I think over the next now 8 years, you're going to see a lot more transit improvements that speeds up the speed and reliability of our transit corridors, but also improves how people access those transit services and those transit corridors. So I think that's just something that we're going to continue to do.
So even though most of the bike walk infrastructure tends to be in jurisdictions right of way, Metro is very committed, and I think as a renewed commitment in our long-range plan, to be investing in these non-motorized connections to transit. So in that plan, you'll see pretty large commitment to building out a bike parking network. So all of our transit hubs will have both short and long-term bike parking options. And then, more importantly, making sure that customers have actually a safe and convenient pathway to get to that bike parking or to walk to our service. So I think what you're going to see more and more is Metro working with local jurisdictions to identify where are those priority gaps in the non-motorized network, partnering with them to raise funds, whether it be through grants or local sources, and really try to fill that gap and make sure that, again, biking and walking should be one of the first choices and one of the most convenient choices for folks where we can make it work.
Dan, you hit on this briefly, but for anyone who wants to jump in, somebody asked or wrote, for a long time there's been a separation of special needs transportation for people with disabilities and older adults in Seattle, talking about how paratransit has sort of been separated into its own thing. How do you see new mobility options serving these and other populations to expand mobility choices and reduce trip costs for paratransit?
Sure. Well, I think I'll probably be stating the obvious here, but I think there's a clear opportunity for some of these services to be providing some of the trips that are done on our paratransit service and at a much lower cost. But I think we need to really carefully evaluate that space and make sure that the right customer is getting the right sort of treatment. So I think moving forward, we're going to be looking at that opportunity. And but that's pretty much all I can say for now.
I think there's some pretty easy fixes to update the antiquated back-end systems that paratransit and other kind of wheelchair-accessible services use. There's like a 1 to 2 day booking process, and when you're talking about really convenient transportation options, that just doesn't fulfill that characteristic. And so I think there are opportunities to make it a little bit more on demand and improve the customer experience for those people that use those services. And that would be a partnership likely between agencies like SDOT and Metro that lead that.
So thinking about sort of the integration of public and private sector, whose role is it going to be, or sort of what is the vision for regulating these services, new mobility services, as they become more and more integrated with the transportation system, and what are the consequences of failing to adhere to regulation, somebody asks.
So that's a question for me. What we've been doing in Seattle that is somewhat unique is leveraging our permitting authority to onboard different types of services. So the typical relationship is different types of companies or different types of services want to enter into the Seattle market. We have some basic public needs that need to be met, and so we set policy parameters that those companies need to adhere to in order to gain access to our public right-of-way. And so we've done that with our free-floating bike share program, our free-floating car share program that ReachNow is participating in Car2Go as well. We also have started a electric vehicle charging program so that companies can come in and site EV charging in the public right-of-way kind of on our terms and at their risk. So that's kind of a unique approach that you'll see a lot of other cities start to utilize. The consequences of not adhering to our regulations is revocation of the permit. So if companies are not meeting their obligations, then we are totally fine with removing a transportation option off the table, or transportation service off of the table.
Can I just add something on the topic of something Naomi brought up earlier, which is policy innovation, and there's a perfectly good reason why BMW decided to invest in placing its mobility services arm here in downtown Seattle, and that's because of the innovative policymakers in this city and the hard work that they did to make sure that the framework conditions were in place so that innovative, new mobility models could set up shop here and hire a bunch of people and provide another transportation option for the residents of Seattle. We participate in permit programs here. Those include car sharing and the transportation network company permit. Very different permits, but those permits are the reason that basically every resident of Seattle who has a driver's license and can drive a car can walk a short distance and pick up a free-floating car-sharing car and use it for a few minutes to get to a job interview or get to a flight or do an errand or whatever their automobility need is at that moment. The reason is the really great policy work that the city has done to encourage that. And it's also the reason why we share as much data as we do with the city because of those policies that are in place. So on the car sharing side, it's parking, a tremendous amount of parking data and an API that shows the location of our cars, which we just integrated with Transit Screen, so that's very exciting news. On the ride-sharing side, it's origin and destination, and we'd like to share more and more data with the city because we know it has an impact on the city's transportation planning.
I just want to add too, again, this transportation equity program is pretty new, and in terms of the policy innovation, there's a lot that we don't know. We've already talked about that. There's a lot of unknowns in this space, but we do need to know or learn what we don't know, and so we are, definitely taking chances, making informed risks, both through the permitting processes that he's already outlined and also through pilots. I mean, pilots are not a new concept, obviously, in transportation. We see them in infrastructure a lot just to test out, how things work. Well, we're doing that with policy as well. And so we're able to, at any point, once we've evaluated a process, learn from it, like understand what didn't work. We can go out to community. We can say, this is what we learned. This is what we think we like. What do you think? And so there's a lot of flexibility, and I think that that's one of the things that we are learning that we need to be flexible about, is that there's a lot we don't know and we need to find out, and so we're having to test. And it is not easy when you learn something that you didn't know that didn't work, but at the same time it gets you to the next possible solution, and it improves the overall product and system and service that you're trying to provide. So.
Great. I'm going to ask a quick question to Dan. I will read this daily bus driver's card. As a daily bus driver, I get frustrated that expensive private car services are considered innovative, while efficient, neighborly big bus service is considered old and boring. I love the bus. How can traditional service rebrand so it can be seen as futuristic as self-driving car services? How do we keep the bus relevant?
That's a great question, and I think I think our long-range plan basically paints a picture of how we're going to not only stay relevant, but grow our market share and kind of be like I said earlier, the first choice. And I think that comes in an expansion of our bus rapid transit network. I think it comes with really thoughtful and true integration with Sound Transit, and as they're bringing new light rail locations online, that we have really integrated services. So not only are we focusing our local service to connect to folks, but we also have this shared mobility hub concept where we can plug in some of these private service providers and the local bus service in kind of a harmonious way. So I think that's the focus of the region. It should be the focus of the region. I think we need our help from our cities to make it, think about how we regulate curb space and how we keep these buses moving fast and give them priority. But I think, all of our agencies, I think, are on the same page where fixed route transit is the priority for most trips. Not every trip. We know that we can't serve some markets as well as some of these more flexible private services, but for most of the corridors, we need to be the first priority, and that's how we're going to stay relevant.
Cool. This is going to be the last question, and I will make it a lightning round for all of you, even though it's an impossibly difficult question to answer quickly. So I think we can probably all agree that the core of our problems with gridlock and congestion and pollution are rooted in private car ownership in Seattle. What would it take to dramatically reduce car ownership in the city?
I'll start. One of the products that we just launched a few weeks ago is Pass, and we really view it as something that's competing directly with car ownership, and it's a service where you pay us a few $100s per month, and then you get basically all of your automobility needs met. So you need a car delivered to you for the weekend, we'll do that. You can take a trip across town, you can be driven in a really personalized premium rideshare type service, all for a fee that's in a lot of cases a fifth the cost of what it is to own a car. So we're really trying to create something that's as convenient, but really it's like way more convenient than owning a car. And so I think that's part of our solution to this broader urban issue of parking congestion. We've already seen that 16% of our members in the last year sold their car. Half of them said it was because of us. So we know we're chipping into it, and we're hoping these new products accelerate and amplify that change.
Perfect.
So I think probably the best way to get to reducing car ownership is to actually price the use of cars based on the actual impact that cars have on our transportation system. And so I don't know when we'll get there in the Puget Sound region, but we're going to have to get there at some point because the way we collect revenues in our state with electric vehicles coming online and the kind of reduced demand for parking, we're going to start seeing some pretty significant impacts on how we finance transportation in our state. So that's probably the best way to get to reducing car ownership and car use, and it hits two birds with one stone. And then I think just getting a transit pass in everyone's hands is probably a good idea.
You're probably not going to like my answer, but it's always complicated. So again, just thinking about, who's sort of in a position to not make that choice or increasingly in that position, people that are living on the margins. I think that we really have to get a handle on our displacement problem here, because if people don't have a choice other than to have a vehicle to get to the places they need and want to get to be in and with their community, and to seek economic opportunity in the city, then we have to really get a handle on it. I think that by expanding our investments in transit itself. I'm kind of plugging Daniel here. I think that that's one way that we can do that, but we also really need to understand that it's tied to overall affordability, so that's housing as well as transportation. So that's my answer. It's very complicated.
As a planner, I would say we need to plan better. I'm going to flip this question and take it a little bit to the county level, because I think the city of Seattle is actually doing a lot of good things, and I think we need to take that experience and bring it to the rest of the county. And it's really aligning, land use policy, where we're making transit investments, and also thinking about the non-motorized network, making sure all those things are coming together, which, if done right, it really helps bring on kind of more equitable pricing of transportation options. It gives people alternatives to get around without a car. I mean, that's kind of the first thing you need, is actually a way to get around if you want to own less cars. And it makes your housing more affordable. So thinking about how parking policies impact the cost of that unit, and whether or not, if you own a car, whether or not you're actually paying for the parking that was built. So I think the city of Seattle actually has some really great examples and continues to innovate in how they're connecting land use policy and parking policy with transportation options. We need to take that to the rest of the county, especially as we're investing in fixed route transit.
Great. With that, I think we're going to wrap things up. Thanks so much to the panel for your great answers. I'm not sure we solved our transportation future, but that was excellent and interesting and informative. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. Thank you for your great questions. And yeah, I'm sure Rachel will hit you up to come to the next quarterly transit talk. All right, have a great afternoon.